I wanted to start with a scene actually from Palestine over 60 years ago. In the spring of 1945, a young Palestinian Trotskyist activist known as Yigael Gluckstein, but later on known as Tony Cliff and one of the founders of the Socialist Workers' Party, was on the run from the police. He was hiding in a shack in Tel Aviv, about to be arrested and put in jail for writing leaflets and taking part in protests. As he was whiling away the time, he worked on a manuscript of a book. It was then an enormous tome analysing what was going on in the Middle East as it entered a period of mass protests, strikes, and he hoped to see revolution. What was interesting about the book, which incidentally is something that's now been put up online and something that you can read on the internet, what was interesting about the book was his utter conviction that the place that he should be looking towards in terms of the real heart of any future revolution in the Middle East was in fact Egypt next door, the country next door. And he in particular focused on the role of the working class in Egypt as being the key to his assessment and his analysis of where liberation could come from in Palestine. At this point, 1945, obviously this is 3 years before even the Nakba has taken place, the establishment of the State of Israel and the massive expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine. But Cliff and his fellow activists, a very small number of Trotskyists who were active at the time in Palestine, along with the vast majority of Palestinian Arab activists, could see that the British authorities in Palestine were colluding in the establishment of a new form of colonial state that was going to be run by the Zionists, the Zionist groups that had come into Palestine over the previous 20 years or so, and that in looking to the working class in Egypt as the key to liberation, not only for Palestine but also for the region as a whole, he planted the seeds of a kind of analysis that over the next 60 years, people in our political tradition and the International Socialists would look to and develop as the kind of core of our understanding of where liberation comes from in relation to the Palestinian question and in relation to the Arab revolutions. Now, if you fast forward 60 years and you look at the situation that we're in at the moment, I want to argue that actually the seeds of what he argued at that point are still very, very relevant today, and that in order to understand the relationship between the struggle for Palestinian liberation and the struggle for liberation in the Arab world more generally, we have to see the interaction between these two struggles. That in order to understand why it is that, although despite the heroic resistance of the Palestinian people, that Palestinians on their own have not been able to get rid of Israeli oppression, end the occupation, and achieve a genuine independent state of their own. But also that this is not a one-way process. It's not about seeing that workers in Egypt or elsewhere in the Middle East are going to carry out and liberate Palestinians as some kind of knights on horseback coming in and saving them from outside. That actually, without the liberation of Palestine, that any kind of liberation in Egypt will be dangerously incomplete. And again, I think if you look at the situation that we see at the moment, you can see that very clearly. So I want to start off really by talking about how this is grounded in an understanding of the strategic importance of the Middle East to global capitalism, and in particular that the dominance of the United States over the global economic system is founded on having domination over the Middle East as a region. That this actually, the strategic importance of the Middle East within global capitalism is also something that has long historic roots. And that over the past more than 100 years, we've seen various imperial powers attempting to assert themselves over the region, but using a mixture of tactics and strategies in order to do that. So in the early part of the 20th century, from the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, you had Britain and France with the chief colonial powers in the region, and they used a mixture of working with a kind of some forms of direct colonialism, or working with groups that were acting, as kind of colonists on behalf of those of France and Britain, and working with local states that would be act on behalf of in alliance with, or as the clients of the imperial powers. So in the case of France, from the mid-19th century up until the early 20th century, you had some direct colonialism, settlers in Algeria and North Africa from France were central to maintaining control over that area. But then after the First World War, you had France working closely with some of the states that grew up in the ruins of the old Ottoman Empire, which was which had been the major power in the region. So, for example, playing a key role in working with the emerging supposedly independent states in Syria and Lebanon at the time. In the case of Britain, British imperialism played a central role in the founding of the Zionist colony in Palestine in the first place. And in fact, it was Ronald Storr, a British official, who described the whole process of Jewish settlement to be about creating a loyal little Jewish Ulster, i.e., like the Protestant community in Northern Ireland being used as a kind of bulwark for the British state against the Catholic majority in Ireland. In the case of Palestine, implanting Jewish settlers there in order to back up British policy in the region, but also British officials worked very closely and supported local Arab states that again emerged out of the Ottoman Empire. So in the case of what would become Saudi Arabia, working with local rulers there. In the case of Egypt, backing and supporting the monarchy that emerged after the First World War, and were very much embedded inside the whole architecture of the Egyptian state. In the 1940s, this whole system broke down, and this is precisely the moment that Tony Cliff was writing about it. It was actually the declining years, the last sort of 5 or 6, 7, 8 years of the old colonial powers' domination of the Middle East. It was an era of massive protests, strikes, revolutions, a huge crisis for Britain and France as they were forced to withdraw from the region under massive waves of popular protests and strikes. What emerged out of this, however, was not what Cliff had hoped for when he was writing in 1945, which was he had hoped to see the beginning of a wave of genuine social revolution. Actually, what happened was that layers of nationalist army officers in places like Egypt and again then in other countries were able to seize control of the state and take power. And you had a period when people like Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was one of the junior officers who overthrew the monarchy in Egypt, became the focus for people's hopes of resistance to imperialism and also of support for the Palestinian struggle. In the middle of this, of course, you had the Nakba, where you had the forced expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians by Zionist militias at the point of the founding of the state of Israel. Fast forward, though, to the 1970s, and actually it became clear that the model that Nasser and people like him had promoted in the 1950s and 60s had actually run into crisis as well. That not this time Britain and France, but the new imperial powers, particularly the United States, began to reassert their domination over the region very, very directly. And since the 1970s, two things have been very much intertwined. Firstly, a kind of the push towards neoliberal policies from the mid-1970s onwards, there was an acute pressure, not only in the Middle East, but across the globe, on states to adopt policies that opened up to privatisation, to the policies of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and to create greater connections and dependency on with the US economy. At the same time, in the case of the Middle East, the United States worked tirelessly to try and break down Egypt's role that it had taken on in the era of Gamal Abdel Nasser of being an apparent bulwark and strength against the Israeli occupation and supporting the Palestinians to actually make peace between the Egyptian state and the Israelis in order to contain the Palestinians and to try and cement Israeli control and domination in the region. This was actually a relatively successful policy. In the late 1970s saw Anwar Sadat, who was Gamal Abdel Nasser's successor and president of Egypt, sign the Camp David Accord, the peace deal with Israel, which led directly to creating the conditions for the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the massacre of Palestinians that followed in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. Noam Chomsky quite rightly called the relationship between Palestine, the Palestinians, the Egyptians and the Israelis a fateful triangle, where you had the Egyptian state at that colluding with the US and the Israelis in order to oppress the Palestinians and to maintain the Israeli occupation. Despite this, Palestinian resistance continued, and again, this is the next point that I want to stress. Despite the efforts of both the imperialist powers and their local allies, like Egypt, to attempt to maintain control, Palestinian resistance from below has always it can constantly threaten to disrupt this this balance. So you actually had the explosion of a wave of Palestinian resistance with the Intifada, the uprising of 1987, and again a second Intifada in 2000. The tragedy, however, I would argue, is that the strategy of the Palestinian leadership has long been based on seeking statehood on the very narrowest kind of terms. That in fact, leaders like Yasser Arafat, who historically led the Palestinian Liberation Organization from its key period of its formation, really from the late 1950s up until his death, that his strategy was based in a sense on trying to replicate what Gamal Abdel Nasser had done in the 1950s, of trying to create a Palestinian state that would respect the boundaries of what it meant to be a state in a region that was dominated by imperialism. That despite the heroic resistance that the Palestinian resistance that the PLO represented, they essentially accepted the idea that there should be no, for example, interference in the affairs of the other Arab states. However, as I mentioned before, imperialism in the region has never simply been about only carried out through support for Israel. It's also always been relied on support from the local Arab regimes, and that therefore actually it was only by deepening the connections between the struggle against those rulers in the Arab world, the struggle from below against Sadat and then his successor Mubarak, that you could actually see the possibility of bringing together a common struggle between Palestinian resistance from below and the real potential strength against those regimes in mobilising the working class and the poor to overthrow them. So the Palestinian experience then, despite these immensely brave and courageous struggles, and despite the huge impact that these struggles had on resistance across the region, has actually been on a trajectory towards greater fragmentation. To to a situation where you have two small Palestinian fragments of states, which are not really states at all, but to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza, and the Hamas and Hamas-controlled area within Gaza. I want to just say briefly in terms of Hamas that despite the demonisation of Hamas in the Western media, it's very important to say that Hamas won the 2006 legislative elections in Palestine because that their leadership represented for vast majority of Palestinians who voted for them something that was much more about resistance rather than capitulation. That it was a vote that recognised that the leadership of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority had got trapped so far into a dead-end peace process that they were actually actively colluding in in perpetuating and deepening the occupation. The tragedy, though, and I'll come on to talk about how in the last couple of years there's been enormous pressure from below in Palestine to try and re-establish unity and to undo this effect of this fragmentation and division. The tragedy has been that the smaller and smaller bits of Palestinian state that have been created have become even more powerless than ever before. So, where do the Arab revolutions fit into this picture? On one level, it seems to be an extremely gloomy picture if you look at it from this perspective. There's been no let-up in the entrenchment of Israeli settlements, and so on and so forth. Well, actually, when you look at when you look at where the Arab revolutions have come from, the first thing I think that it's important to say is that they've emerged out of the explosive social contradictions that you've seen created across the region by transition from largely kind of state capitalist economies of the 1950s and 1960s, the kind of economic policies that were pioneered in the region by people like Nasser, towards these more neoliberal policies that I mentioned, have been bound up very much with the assertion of US domination over the area. If you look at the case of Tunisia and Egypt, Tunisia, of course, is the spark that lit the whole process of revolution in the Arab world in late 2010 into 2011, and Egypt was then the next country to explode into revolution. You can see then in both of these cases how there was a combination of workers' strikes, protests by the unemployed, protests over social issues, over the problems of marginalisation and unemployment, combined with a massive struggle against political repression and dictatorship, and that it's the combination of these two sides of the struggle in both of these countries which is critical to understanding how it was that a revolution could emerge and explode in 2011. It's actually also important to say, and this is where the connection really with the previous waves of Palestinian resistance is so important, that solidarity with the Palestinians has been central to the political struggle in both of those countries, and particularly in Egypt in recent years. In fact, if you ask Egyptian activists, revolutionaries, many of them will tell you that it's actually to trace the history before that led up to the revolution. You have to go back to the massive popular protests in solidarity with the Intifada in Palestine that broke out in Egypt in 2000 and continued for several years after that. It was actually those kind of networks of the Popular Committee to support the Palestinian Intifada, for example, that a lot of the connections were made that would later be solidified and were the bedrock of the networks that were part of the opposition networks that called the protests against Mubarak in 2011. The other thing that's really important, I think, to say about the Arab revolutions within the picture that I've sketched is that what you could call the social soul of the Arab revolutions has continued to grow since 2011, you continue to see massive waves of strikes and protests. In the case of Egypt, a useful statistic that you can that encapsulates this is in 2010 there were around 500 strikes and protests by workers in the course of that year in Egypt. In 2011, which obviously included the year of the first year of the revolution, there was something like 1,400 strikes. Last year there were nearly 4,000 strikes in Egypt over a whole range of different issues. And you've seen a wave of massive strikes and protests in Tunisia, where the heartlands of the revolution have been in revolt again. A general strike just recently over the assassination of one of the key leftist leaders, Shukri Balaid, for example. And that what you see, why these are so important, is because they show that the governments that have come into power as a result of the revolution, which have, in both cases, in Tunisia and Egypt, are Islamist governments led by the Ennahda party in Tunisia, or by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that these are in a completely different position to the regimes that they replaced. That they're much weaker at home. They're under enormous pressure from below to actually deliver on people's hopes for change within the revolution, and they face extremely high levels of social and political struggle. And this makes a huge difference in their ability to play the role that they ought to do from the perspective of, particularly the US government's perspective of maintaining its domination over the Middle East. That they don't have a space within which they can play the same kind of role that, say, Hosni Mubarak could play in maintaining the fateful triangle, and maintaining the whole architecture of imperial oppression within the region. This doesn't mean, of course, that you can immediately see the possibilities, the road to Palestinian liberation opening up before us. This is a process that we're talking about. But I think that events in recent months have actually underlined how different the situation is as a result of the Arab revolutions compared to the situation before. Just to finish, I want to just draw out some comments around, if you compare the situation for all of the key actors involved in around the recent Israeli attacks on Gaza. The so-called Operation Pillar of Cloud, if you compare it to the situation with the Operation Cast-led, the Israeli attack on Gaza in 2008-2009, I think you can see that the situation has changed at both the regional and local levels for pretty much everybody, even if this is still at a stage where the actual, whereas I said, the process by which genuine liberation for Palestinians and for people across the region is still in play. So, for example, if you take the situation facing the leadership of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, actually they faced enormous pressure from inside the West Bank. There were huge protests in solidarity with Gaza. Miriam Al-Rag, who's a colleague and a friend who was over there very recently doing field work for her research, said that she felt very strongly that the PLO leadership was absolutely shocked that people would come into the streets and protest in solidarity with Hamas in Gaza, despite their attempts to try and play on that division. But if you look as well, though, at the situation in terms of Egypt, again the situation is very different. The Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi was able to make an intervention into at the height of the crisis, which on the global stage appeared to have done him a lot of good. He came out of it being applauded by the international media for playing a role as mediator and so on, and striking a deal that was that ended the conflict temporarily. However, if you look at the pressure that he's under in terms of the situation at home, you can see how different the situation is. That only within a few days of the Gaza crisis ending, Morsi brought in changes to the proposed changes to the constitution, which triggered an enormous wave of protests and crisis within Egypt, and huge demonstrations, and a kind of backdrop of crisis that continues to this day. But again, if you look at the pressures on the Israelis and the US, despite having massed tens of thousands of troops on the border, there wasn't a ground invasion of Gaza. The Israelis were forced to draw back from the brink, and that regional powers like Egypt and Qatar, for example, who both sent officials to Gaza at the point when the bombing was taking place, actually again was a sign of the constraints that the changed situation was putting both the Israelis and even more particularly the US under. That the situation is extremely dangerous for anyone within Israel or the US, and fraught with risks if they attempt to behave in a way that they had done just simply as if nothing had changed in the region. Now, just very finally to finish, as I said before, I think it's important to understand that this is an unfinished process. The Arab revolutions themselves are an unfinished process, and the outcome of them is still uncertain. Likewise, the struggle for Palestinian liberation remains unfinished. We may see, and I hope we will see, cross-fertilisation deepening between Palestinians on the ground who are leading and continuing to lead in resistance from below to the occupation, and to try and build connections and links with the ongoing revolutions elsewhere in the region, and that those revolutions themselves will continue to deepen, continue to exert as much pressure as possible on the governments that emerge out of that, and preferably actually push them forward to a stage where they're starting to really challenge the whole way that imperialism has managed to maintain the occupation of Palestine and maintain the operation of the fateful triangle over the past 50 or 60 years.